I woke up on the shore among the wreckage and the screams of strangers. People around me were already making plans: a camp, a signal, a rescue. They thought this was an ordinary island. They were wrong. The sand was a coarse, unnatural gray, stinging against my cheek where the salt water had dried into a crust. Around me, the chaos of the crash was still unfolding. The Aegean blue was no longer a ship, it was a jagged spine of steel and white fiberglass protruding from the surf, being slowly swallowed by the tide. I counted roughly 40 people stumbling through the debris. Some were pulling bodies from the shallows, others were frantically tearing through the 3 crates that had washed up intact, our only inheritance from civilization. Then, the world flickered. It wasn't a hallucination or a dizzy spell. A thin, translucent line of text etched itself onto the bottom of my field of vision, so subtle it was almost part of the horizon. Observer protocol activated, current sector, shoreline, beta, environmental stability, 31%, reconfiguration window, 5 hours 52 minutes and 14 seconds, I blinked, but the numbers remained, ticking down with cold, mechanical precision. Below the main display, a smaller prompt pulsed, warning, stability threshold low. Structural transition imminent. I didn't have time to process it. A shadow fell over me. Hey, kid. You alive or just staring at the clouds? The voice was deep, commanding. I looked up to see Sojun. He was a mountain of a man, his shirt torn to reveal the scarred shoulders of someone who had spent a decade in the infantry. He was already organizing the others, assigning tasks with the practiced ease of a natural leader. Behind him, 2 men were tending to a woman with a mangled leg. The panic was still there, but Sojun was a tether, keeping them from drifting into madness. I'm fine, I said, pushing myself up. My legs felt like lead. Good. We're short on hands. The crates only have some dry rations and a few emergency blankets. No water. If we don't find a source before the sun hits its peak, we're done for. He gathered a group of 8 people, all the strongest-looking men and women. We're heading inland, Sojun announced, his voice carrying over the sound of the crashing waves. There's a break in the trees there. If there's a hill, there's a stream. I looked toward the tree line where he was pointing. My eyes caught on a shimmering distortion in the air, a glitch-like ripple that only I seemed to see. The system responded instantly. Projection, inland trail, sector delta, stability, 42%, evening transition risk, 67%, status, unstable pathway, wait, I called out. My voice sounded thin against the wind. Don't go that way. At least, not that path. It's not safe. Sojun paused, his hand on his hip. He looked at the lush, seemingly peaceful jungle, then back at me. And why is that? You a survival expert? Or maybe you've got a map? The group looked at me with a mix of irritation and exhaustion. They didn't want warnings, they wanted hope. I just have a feeling, I said, unable to explain the glowing red text in my eyes. The ground there, it's not stable. We should stay on the beach until we know more. A feeling? Sojun scoffed, turning back to the forest. People are bleeding out and dehydrating. Your feeling doesn't fill canteens. Stay here and rest your head, kid. You clearly hit it harder than the rest of us. I watched them disappear into the dense foliage. My system flickered again, the stability of the shoreline dropping to 29%. I stayed behind, ignored and isolated, while the others began to set up a pathetic camp out of salvaged tarp. 2 hours later, a shout echoed from the forest. It wasn't a scream of pain, but of joy. The group returned, their faces flushed and their hands wet. Found it, one of the men yelled, hoisting a plastic jug. A clear stream, barely a kilometer in. It's fresh, cold, and there's plenty of it. The camp erupted. People rushed forward, cupping their hands to drink the water Sojun had brought back. Even the injured were given a share. As I watched them, my vision centered on the jug. Object identified, freshwater, sampled, current purity, 96%, cycle warning, fluid shift scheduled, contamination risk in 8 hours, 89%. The water was safe now. But the island had a rhythm, a schedule of toxicity that no one else could see. I walked over to the main supply pile. Among the scrap, I found a single, dented 5-gallon canister. While the others were celebrating and thanking Sojun for his heroic find, I quietly filled my canister from the remaining jugs they had brought back. "Going to hide some for yourself, kid?" Sojun asked, walking past me with a triumphant smirk. "Thought you said it wasn't safe." "It's safe for now," I replied, my voice flat. "But things change." "Sure they do," he laughed, clapping a hand on my shoulder. "Keep your feelings. I'll stick to the water." As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting long, twisted shadows across the gray sand, I didn't join the main group by the fire they had started near the tree line. Instead, I dragged my canister and a piece of scrap metal to a high rocky outcrop, nearly 100 yards away from the camp. Sector, rocky shelf, stability, 88%, status, secure for transition. I lay down, my head resting on my arm, watching the countdown in my vision. Reconfiguration in 5 minutes, the night was silent, save for the rhythmic crashing of the waves. But then, a new sound began. It wasn't the wind. It was a low, subsonic hum that made my teeth ache. I sat up, watching the camp below. By the third day, the survivors had fallen into a rhythm dictated not by the island, but by Sojun. He had moved the camp back to the stream, confident that the previous morning's sickness had been a fluke, perhaps a bit of sea salt in the containers or a bad berry. He had established a primitive but effective hierarchy, the producers and the dependents. If you could carry timber, hunt the small, lizard-like creatures in the brush, or scout the interior, you were a producer. You ate first. If you were injured, old, or, like me, deemed unreliable, you were a dependent. I watched from the fringes as Sojun gathered 15 of his strongest men. They had found a grove on the southern slope of a nearby ridge, laden with heavy, purple-skinned fruits that smelled of honey and ozone. To the starving crowd, it looked like a miracle. Sector, southern slope, fruiting body, nutritional value, high, biostability cycle, 18 hours, degradation alert, toxicity spike at transition, time remaining, 4 hours 12 minutes and 44 seconds. I stood near the edge of the grove as they began to harvest. They weren't just picking what they needed for the afternoon, they were filling crates, stuffing their pockets, and planning a 3-day stockpile. It was the logical thing to do in any other world. You find a surplus, you secure it. "You're just going to stand there and watch," one of the men sneered at me, his face stained with purple juice. "Or are you waiting for us to hand-feed you?" I didn't answer. I reached up and plucked 3 fruits, only 3. I checked the timer again. 4 hours. After that, the sweetness would turn into a caustic neurotoxin. "Take more," a voice said behind me. It was Lee Nari, the woman who had been a biologist before the world turned into a gray beach. She was looking at the fruit with a mix of hunger and professional curiosity. "At this rate, Sojun's group will have it all by tonight." "Don't," I said, loud enough only for her to hear. "The island doesn't give gifts. It gives windows. This window is closing." She looked at me, her eyes narrowing. She had seen me with the water canister on the first night. She had seen that I was the only one who hadn't spent the morning retching. "What do you mean, a window?" "Eat these now," I said, handing her one of my 3 fruits. "Don't touch the ones they bring back to camp tomorrow morning. Just trust me." The next morning, the face slap was silent but devastating. I sat by my small, isolated fire, peeling my last safe fruit. Across the clearing, Sojun's stockpile had turned. The honey-sweet scent had been replaced by the stench of rotting meat and ammonia. 4 of the men who had gorged themselves the night before were huddled in their blankets, their skin burning with fever, their breaths coming in ragged, wet gasps. Sojun stood over the ruined crates, his jaw tight. He looked at the black, oozing fruit, then his gaze shifted to me. I was sitting 50 yards away, healthy, eating the last of the purple flesh. I didn't say "I told you so." I didn't have to. The tension between us thickened, a physical weight in the humid air. He saw my survival not as luck, but as a withheld secret. I began to realize that the island wasn't a chaotic mess of shifting terrain. It was a machine with a clock. I started my time map in the dirt, later transferring it to a salvaged piece of plastic with a chartstick. It wasn't a map of where, but a map of when. Point 1, the stream. Fresh for 8 hours, then salt-contaminated for 2. Point 2, the south slope. Edible for 18 hours, then toxic for 54. Point 3. The Western Tide Pools. Fish trapped for a 2-hour window during the minor tide. Point 4. The Central Trail. Stable during the day, but a death trap 30 minutes after any rainfall. It was a schedule. If we followed the rhythm, we lived. If we imposed our own logic, we died. The dread deepened on the 5th night. Park Shul, a quiet man in his 50s who rarely spoke but always worked, vanished. He had laid his bedroll at the eastern edge of the camp, near a cluster of vibrant, bioluminescent ferns. By dawn, the ferns were gone, replaced by a jagged limestone outcrop. And Park Shul was gone with them. The camp erupted in a different kind of panic. "There's something in the woods," a woman screamed. "A beast." It took him without a sound. Sojun was already on his feet, his hand gripping a sharpened piece of rebar. "Everyone in the center. Now. We stay together. If something is hunting us, we make it regret it." I looked at my internal display, scrolling back through the logs I had been subconsciously recording. Sector, Eastern Margin, Event Log, 3 hours 45 minutes and 12 seconds, Geological Shift, Stability during Shift, 0.6%, Reconfiguration Type, Overlap, Probability of Biological Survival in Overlap Zone, 0.4%. Park Shul wasn't murdered. He wasn't hunted. He had simply been standing on a piece of the world that decided to be somewhere else at 3:45 a.m. "It wasn't an animal," I whispered. Nari was standing near me, her face pale. "Then what?" she asked. "How does a man just disappear from his sleeping bag?" "The island reconfigures," I said, finally letting her in on the truth. "It's like a giant clock with gears the size of forests. At 3:45, the East Zone reset." He was just caught in the teeth of the gears. "You knew," she said, her voice trembling. "You knew that spot was dangerous." "I knew it was unstable," I corrected. "I didn't know it would vanish tonight." This was my first true dilemma. If I told everyone, I would have to explain the system. They would call me a freak, a witch, or worse, they would blame me for Park Shul's death because I hadn't warned him. But if I stayed silent, someone else would sleep in a reset zone tonight. I pulled Nari aside, away from the frantic shouting of Sojun's war council. "Listen to me," I said, my voice low and urgent. "I can't save everyone. They won't listen to me anyway. But I can tell you where to stand. Don't sleep near the trees. Don't sleep near anything that looks new. Follow me, and stay within the lines I draw." She looked at the chaos of the camp. Sojun was currently accusing a younger man of stealing Park Shul's rations, his paranoia blooming like a weed. She saw the fear, the hunger, and the ignorance. Then she looked at me. I was the only person on this island who didn't look afraid. "Okay," she whispered. "I'm with you." But the suspicion I feared was already taking root. Sojun turned away from the man he was bullying and pointed the rebar at me. "You," he barked. "You're always awake at night. You're always off by yourself, watching us. You knew the water would turn. You knew the fruit would rot. And now Park is gone, and you're over there whispering to the doctor like nothing happened." The crowd turned. 40 pairs of eyes, clouded by exhaustion and terror, settled on me. I was the anomaly. In a world that made no sense, the man who seemed to understand it was the most dangerous threat of all. "Where is he, Woojin?" Sojun stepped forward, his massive frame blotting out the morning sun. "Where did you put him?" "I didn't put him anywhere," I said, keeping my voice steady even as the group began to close in. The ground moved. The trees shifted. If you were watching the shadows instead of your own ego, you'd have seen it too. Sojun didn't flinch. He took another step, the tip of the rebar scraping against the stones. "The ground doesn't move, kid. People move. People steal. People kill when they think they're smarter than everyone else. You've been hoarding water, you've been eating while others starved, and now a man is gone from the very spot you told Nari was dangerous. That's not a coincidence. That's a confession." The logic was flawed, but to 40 terrified people, it was perfect. They needed a villain because they couldn't fight an island that rewrote itself every 6 hours. They could fight me. "Search his bag," someone shouted from the back. Two of Sojun's producers lunged forward. I didn't resist. They tore through my meager belongings, the rusted canister, a few scraps of dry cloth, and the plastic sheet where I had begun scratching the time map. One of them held up the plastic sheet, squinting at the charred markings. "What is this?" Sojun demanded, snatching the sheet. He looked at the lines, the arrows, and the numbers I had scribbled. "It's a schedule," I said. "It's how we survive. The island isn't random. It's a clock. That map shows when the water is safe and when the path's open." Sojun looked at the map, then back at me. He didn't see a lifeline. He saw a ledger of secrets. "A schedule? You've been tracking us. You've been waiting for us to fail so you could play God with your feelings. You knew Park would be taken, and you let it happen just to prove a point." He crumpled the plastic sheet in his massive fist. "We don't need your schedules. From this moment on, we have a new law. The island law. No one goes anywhere alone. All food, all water, is brought to the center of the camp and distributed by me. We sleep in one circle, back to back. Anyone caught whispering, anyone caught wandering off, anyone caught predicting things, will be treated as an enemy of this group." The crowd murmured in agreement. It was the comfort of a cage, but it was comfort nonetheless. They were trading their autonomy for the illusion of safety under a strong man's shadow. Sector, camp center, stability rating, 62%, alert, geological tension increasing, projection, RE leveling event in 14 hours and 22 minutes. I looked at the ground where they were all standing, the safe center. The system was screaming in red. The very spot Sojun had chosen for his fortress was a pressure point in the island's machinery. In 14 hours, it would buckle. "Fine," I said, leaning back against a tree that I knew would remain stable for at least 2 days. "Have it your way. But when the ground starts to scream, don't look at me for an exit." Sojun ignored me, turning his back to address his new citizens. He began organizing patrols, assigning guards to watch the perimeter not for monsters, but for me. I was officially the pariah, a ghost in their midst. Nari walked past me a few minutes later, carrying a heavy branch for the communal fire. She didn't stop, but as she leaned down to drop the wood, she whispered, "He's going to get them killed, isn't he?" "He's applying the logic of a battlefield to a laboratory," I replied, my eyes fixed on the ticking clock in my vision. "The island doesn't care who's in charge. It only cares who's in the way." "What do I do?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Stay near the western edge of his circle," I said. "It's the only part of the safe zone that won't collapse when the shift happens. And keep your boots on." The rest of the day was a slow, agonizing descent into madness. Sojun's men marched into the jungle, trying to find the fruit grove again. They returned hours later, scratched and empty-handed. The path they had used the day before was gone, replaced by a wall of thorny vines that bled a milky, caustic sap. The kid probably blocked it. I heard one of them mutter, glaring at me as I sat in silence. They were hungry, they were tired, and their leader was failing to provide. Sojun's response was to tighten the grip. He cut the water rations. He doubled the guards. He spent the evening sharpening his rebar, staring into the fire with the eyes of a man who was losing a war against an invisible enemy. I watched it all, my system logging every failure. Data point acquired, human adaptation failure, observer status, isolated, efficiency rating, 92%. As the sun set, the island began to groan. It was a sound like grinding stones, deep beneath the earth. The center of the camp, where 30 people were huddled together, began to vibrate. Sojun stood up, his hand on his weapon. "Stay still. It's just the tide." It wasn't the tide. It was the gears turning. I stood up and walked toward the edge of the camp, my eyes locked on the 3 seconds remaining on the countdown. A guard moved to block my path, but I didn't stop. "Get back in the circle, freak," he hissed, raising a club. "Look behind you," I said. The ground at the center of the camp suddenly heaved upward. It wasn't a violent explosion, but a slow, tectonic tilt. A massive slab of granite, hidden beneath the dirt, began to rotate. Tents were torn apart as the earth split. People screamed, scrambling to stay on the shifting surface. Sojun tried to grab a woman who was sliding toward a widening crack, but the ground was slick with mud and ancient moss. The safe center was now a 40-degree slope, dumping everyone toward the dark, grasping tree-line. In the chaos, Nari moved. She scrambled toward the western edge, just as I had told her. She reached the stable ground and watched in horror as the rest of the camp was swallowed by the sudden transformation of the landscape. When the dust settled, the camp was unrecognizable. The stream had been diverted, the fire was buried under 3 feet of shale, and Sojun was left standing on a jagged peak of rock, 5 feet above everyone else, looking down at the wreckage of his authority. I stood in the shadows, untouched. My water canister was full. My mind was clear. "The island doesn't kill," I said, my voice cutting through the whimpers of the injured. "It just moves. And if you aren't moving with it, you're just debris." Sojun looked at me from his stone pedestal. The hatred in his eyes was gone, replaced by something much more dangerous, the realization that I was the only thing on this island that made sense. The morning after the center of the camp tilted into a jagged shale heap, the air felt different. It was thicker, smelling of wet stone and crushed ferns. I sat on a flat-topped boulder, my legs dangling over a drop that hadn't existed 24 hours ago. My eyes were fixed on the translucent HUD of the protocol, watching the flickering percentages of the surrounding sectors. Sector, shale slope, beta, stability, 41% degrading, trend, collapse imminent in 6 hours and 12 minutes. A soft crunch of gravel made me turn. It was Lee Nari. She wasn't carrying wood this time. She held a small, leather-bound notebook, its edges frayed and stained with salt water. She didn't say a word as she sat down beside me. She opened the book to a page filled with neat, cramped handwriting and sketches of the purple fruit, the bioluminescent ferns, and the strange, metallic-tasting water from the stream. "I've been tracking the mutations," she said, her voice raspy from the dust. "The fruit didn't just rot. Its cellular structure underwent a rapid, catalyzed breakdown. It's like the island decided its purpose was over and triggered a self-destruct sequence." I glanced at her notes. They were remarkably accurate. She had recorded the exact times of the rot and the appearance of the ferns. "You're comparing your data to the environment," I noted. "Most people here are just comparing it to their memories of home. That's why they're dying." "I saw what you did last night," she said, looking me in the eye. "You didn't just guess. You knew exactly where the fold line was. I want to know how. Not because I want to steal it, I want to understand it. If we don't have a map of the when, we're just walking ghosts." I hesitated. The protocol was a part of me now, a silent, cold voice in the back of my skull. To explain it was to sound insane. But Nari wasn't looking for a miracle, she was looking for a pattern. "I don't have a map," I said, pointing to my temple. "I have a feed. It gives me probabilities. Stability ratings. The island has a pulse, Nari. It has a schedule. If you want to survive, you stop looking at the trees and start looking at the time." I spent the next hour showing her the basics. Not the protocol itself, but the conclusions it drew. I showed her how to look for the shimmer, the slight distortion in the air that preceded a sector shift. We were so engrossed in the data that we didn't notice the shadow hovering nearby until a small, jagged rock skipped past my foot. "You guys look like you're plotting a coup," a voice chirped. It was Mganu. He was 16, thin as a rail, with dark, cynical eyes that seemed too old for his face. He had spent the last few days in the periphery of Sojun's group, acting as a runner, but I had noticed him watching me more than once. "What do you want, Ganu?" I asked. "Sojun says I'm surplus calories," the boy said, leaning against a tree with a bored expression. "Says if I can't carry a 50-pound crate, I don't get a full ration. But I'm fast. And I can move through the brush without snapping a single twig. I've been following you two for an hour. You didn't hear a thing." He was right. I hadn't. The protocol hadn't flagged him because he wasn't a threat to the environment, he was part of it. "I heard what you said about the when," Ghana continued, his eyes darting to my plastic sheet. "I don't care about the science. I just want to be where the ground isn't going to eat me. I scouted the northwest cliffside this morning. There's a flat area there. All rock. No plants. Feels solid. I checked the system. Sector, Northwest Cliffs, anchor point, stability, 78%, duration, 48 to 00 to 00 plus, status, anomalously stable. My heart hammered against my ribs. 78%. In this place, that was practically a fortress. The anchor zone, I whispered. Sojun won't go there, Ganu added. He wants to stay near the beach. He's convinced a ship is coming. He's building a rescue signal out of the wreckage. It's a mountain of trash that's going to be underwater by midnight if the tide keeps shifting the way you said. I looked at Nari, then at Ganu. We were an unlikely team, an analyst, a biologist, and a street-smart scout. We leave tonight, I said. Quietly. If we try to take everyone, we'll never make it. Sojun has guards on the perimeter to stop deserters. We need to move during the transition window. The gold window, Nari said, catching on. When the sectors reset. Exactly. We have 4 hours of stability starting at 2 a.m. That's our exit. The roles were set. I would provide the analysis and the timing. Nari would document the biological shifts and find sustainable food sources that didn't follow the island's toxic cycles. Ganu would be our eyes, scouting the path ahead and ensuring we weren't being followed. But leaving wasn't as simple as walking away. That night, as the rest of the survivors huddled around a dying fire, Sojun sat on his stone throne, his rebar spear held across his knees. He hadn't slept. His eyes were bloodshot, scanning the dark. He had lost his camp, his supplies were dwindling, and his authority was the only thing keeping him from falling apart. Where are you going, Woojin? His voice boomed through the silence as we tried to slip past the eastern edge of the rocks. We froze. 3 guards stood up from the shadows, their makeshift clubs ready. To find a place that doesn't collapse, I said, not turning back. No one leaves, Sojun said, standing up. We stay together. That's the only way we survive. You leave now, you're taking resources from the group. You're a thief. We aren't taking anything but our own lives, Nari snapped. The beach is going to flood, so June look at the waterline. It's 10 feet higher than it was yesterday. The tide comes in, the tide goes out. So June roared. I'm not letting you divide this group further. Get back to the center. I checked the protocol. Transition starting, 2 minutes and 11 seconds, sector, camp perimeter, stability dropping, 18%. The ground is about to shift again, so June, I said, my voice cold. In 2 minutes, this path is going to become a ravine. If you want to stay and play king of the rubble, go ahead. But we're moving. Stop them, so June commanded his guards. The men stepped forward, but Ganu was faster. He kicked a pile of loose shale, sending a cascade of dust into the guard's eyes. In the confusion, he grabbed a discarded tarp and threw it over the fire, plunging the area into near-total darkness. Run! Ganu hissed. We bolted. Behind us, I heard Sojun's roar of fury and the sound of heavy boots hitting the stone. But then, the groan began. The island's 2 a.m. transition had started. The earth beneath the camp screamed as it tore itself apart. I didn't look back to see the guards falling into the new fissures. I only looked at the green line in my vision, leading us toward the northwest. We reached the northwest cliffs an hour later. It was exactly as Ganu had described, a massive, flat shelf of granite, overlooking the churning, gray ocean. It felt different here. The air was colder, and the subsonic hum of the island was muffled, as if the rock itself was a shield. Sector, anchor zone, stability, 81%, status, secure. We're safe, Nari gasped, collapsing onto the hard stone. For now. Not for long, I said, looking back at the distant, flickering fire of the old camp. He'll come for us. When the beach floods and his signal is washed away, he'll have nowhere else to go. And he won't come to join us. He'll come to take what we have. I stood at the edge of our new territory, watching the 81% stability rating. It was the highest I had seen since the crash. But as I watched, a new notification appeared on my HUD. Proximity alert, multiple stability fluctuations detected in radius, cause, human interference. I looked down. Below the cliff, a line of survivors was already trudging through the mud, led by the unmistakable, hulking silhouette of Sojun. They weren't running. They were marching. The survivors arrived at the base of the northwest cliffs just as the first gray light of dawn touched the horizon. They were a pathetic sight, soaked, shivering, and carrying the few scraps of salvage they had managed to cling to during the midnight collapse. At the head of the column was Sojun, his jaw set in a grim line of defiance, his eyes fixed on the flat granite shelf where we stood. "It's a long climb, Sojun," I called down from the edge. "And the path up is only stable for another 40 minutes. He didn't answer. He simply began to climb, pulling his massive frame up the jagged rocks with a brute strength that seemed fueled by pure spite. The others followed, clawing at the stone like drowning sailors. When the last of them finally collapsed onto the anchor zone, the granite plateau felt suddenly crowded. 22 people breathing hard, their eyes darting around the barren, windswept rock. Sector, anchor zone, current population, 25, stability rating, 78% stable, warning, biomass interference detected. "This is it?" Sojun panted, wiping salt from his brow. "A slab of rock? No trees, no water, just wind?" "It's a place that doesn't move," I said, stepping forward. "That's the most valuable resource on this island. You can stay here. But there are rules. No digging. No fire pits deeper than 3 inches. And absolutely no cutting into the roots that grow in the crevices. This rock is anchored by them. You damage the anchors, the zone destabilizes." Sojun stood up, towering over me. "Rules? You're giving orders now, kid? Look around you. These people are freezing. We need a fire. We need a perimeter. We need to act like a community, not a bunch of hermits living on a cliff." "I'm not giving orders," I said, my voice dropping an octave. "I'm giving you the physics of this island. Ignore them, and you'll find out why I left the beach." For a few hours, a tense truce held. Nari began documenting the mosses that clung to the granite, while Ghana kept a sharp eye on the supplies. Sojun's people, however, were restless. They were used to a style of survival, aggressive, loud, and transformative. To them, the anchor zone felt like a prison. The face slap happened at noon. One of Sojun's most loyal producers, a man named Manhwa, decided he had had enough of the cold wind. He found a thick, gnarled root, half wood, half stone, protruding from a deep crack in the center of the plateau. It was the primary anchor point for the entire sector. He took his salvaged hatchet and swung. Clang! The sound echoed across the cliffs. I was on my feet instantly. Stability critical, stability rating, 61%, falling, event triggered, atmospheric phase shift. "Stop!" I yelled, but Manhwa swung again, severing the top of the root. A dark, viscous fluid, not sap, but something like liquid mercury, began to ooze from the wound. "It's just wood, kid." Manhwa laughed, holding up a piece of the root. "We need a fire that'll actually last." I didn't argue. I didn't waste time shouting. I turned to Nari and Ganu. "Grab your gear. Now. Move to the northern tip, past the basalt line." "What's happening?" Nari asked, grabbing her notebook. "The island is breathing in," I said. A low, vibrating hum began to rise from the granite itself. It was the sound of a tuning fork struck by a giant. Suddenly, the temperature plummeted. A thick, suffocating fog began to roll in, not from the sea, but out of the very cracks in the rock. It was a white, opaque wall that smelled of ozone and ancient dust. "Sojun! Get your people to the edge!" I shouted, but it was too late. The fog swallowed the center of the plateau in seconds. It wasn't just mist, it was a sensory vacuum. Within the cloud, the survivors began to scream. They couldn't see their own hands. Their voices sounded muffled, as if they were shouting through miles of cotton. Panic, the island's favorite weapon, took hold. They ran blindly, tripping over one another, drifting toward the jagged edges of the cliff. I stood with Nari and Ganu on a narrow strip of basalt that the protocol marked in bright, neon green. We were inches from the fog, but the air around us remained perfectly clear. Sector, basalt subzone, stability, 91%, status, isolated from phase shift. We watched as the white wall boiled and churned. Shadows moved within it, distorted, terrifying shapes of the survivors stumbling in the dark. Sojun's voice was a frantic roar, trying to command a group that could no longer see him. Should we help them? Nari whispered, her knuckles white as she gripped my arm. If we go in, we get lost too, I said. The fog is a localized instability. It'll pass in 4 minutes. If they stay still, they'll live. But they didn't stay still. They were terrified. When the fog finally dissipated, the scene was one of total disarray. 3 people were hanging off the edge of the cliff, saved only by the jagged rocks below. Everyone else was huddled on the ground, weeping or gasping for air. Manhwa, the man who had cut the route, was catatonic, his eyes wide and staring at nothing. I walked into the center of the clearing, my boots clicking rhythmically on the stone. I held my water canister in one hand, looking as calm as if I had just woken up from a nap. Sojun was on his knees, his face pale, his hands shaking. He looked up at me, and for the first time, I saw real fear in his eyes. Not fear of me, fear of the fact that I was the only person who wasn't surprised. You knew, he rasped. You let this happen. I told you the rules, I said, loud enough for everyone to hear. I told you what would happen if you cut the anchors. You chose to listen to him, I pointed at Manhwa, instead of the island. Nari stepped forward, standing firmly at my side. She looked at the shivering survivors, then at Sojun. He tried to warn you. From now on, I'm not following a leader who leads us into a blind fog. I'm following the data. I'm following Wojin. The silence that followed was heavy. The neutral survivors, the ones who had been caught between Sojun's strength and my strange predictions, looked from the broken mountain of a man on the floor to the calm, steady figure standing before them. He knows, someone whispered. He knows how to control it. I don't control it, I corrected sharply. I observe it. And if you want to live, you'll start doing the same. The rift was no longer a secret. It was a canyon. Sojun stood up slowly, his dignity shattered but his resolve hardening into something brittle and dangerous. He didn't speak, but he looked at the severed root, then back at me. The anchor zone was no longer a sanctuary. It was a battlefield. And the island had just signaled the start of the next round. The anchor zone was no longer just a flat slab of granite, it had become a clock face, and we were the gears. Over the next few days, I stopped treating survival as a series of lucky escapes and started treating it as an engineering problem. We weren't a camp anymore. We were a functional unit, a living machine designed to process the island's data into calories and safety. Sector, anchor zone, stability, 71%, current occupancy, 28, revenue, systematic surplus. My core group had grown. It started with Nari and Ganu, but soon 2 others drifted toward the northern basalt line, away from Sojun's brooding circle. The first was Han Sung-ho. He was 45, with the thick, calloused hands of a professional chef and the weary eyes of a man who had seen enough tough guys fail to know better. He approached me while I was marking the next water cycle in the stone. I don't care about your protocol or your windows, Sung-ho said, dropping a bundle of salvaged metal pans near my feet. But I've watched Sojun try to boil seawater in a plastic bucket. He's a soldier, but he's an idiot. I've been a cook for 20 years. Give me a heat source that doesn't blow up in whatever weird roots the lady biologist finds, and I'll make sure nobody dies of malnutrition. What's the job? I looked at him, then at the protocol. I have one question for you, Sung-ho, I said. What can you do that the island can't? He didn't hesitate. The island can change the shape of the world, kid. But it can't season a stew. I can take something bitter and make it fuel. I can turn chaos into a meal. That's something your clock doesn't know how to do. Accepted, I said. You're the quartermaster. You handle the energy output. The second was Choi Yunji. She was 22, a student who looked like she was one loud noise away from a total breakdown. She was quiet, shivering even in the heat, but she sat in the corner of our zone and stared at the shifting treeline for hours without blinking. She's a liability, Gano whispered to me. She just stares. We don't need more mouths to feed. I walked over to her. She didn't look up. What are you looking at, Yunji? The leaves, she whispered. 3 days ago, the serrated ones were on the left. Then they moved to the right. But they didn't just move. They changed their vein patterns. The veins match the cracks in the granite we're standing on. It's a mirror. I froze. I checked my HUD. The protocol hadn't flagged the leaf veins, it was too focused on the macrogeological stability. I looked at Yunji. What can you do that the island can't? I asked the same question. I can remember, she said, finally looking up. Her eyes were bloodshot but sharp. The island overwrites itself. It forgets what it was yesterday. I don't. I remember every shape. Every pattern. I remember what was here before it changed. Accepted, I said. You're the archive. You catch what the system misses. By the end of the week, our base was a masterpiece of timing. Nari had identified 3 water points that functioned on an 8-hour offset. Sunho had built a smokeless stove using the basalt vents. Ghana had mapped 4 scouting routes that stayed stable as long as no one spoke above a whisper. We were thriving while Sojun's faction was rotting. But then, the data coalesced into something bigger. Nari and I sat over her notebook, comparing her biological timestamps with my protocol's stability logs. It's not just small shifts, Nari said, drawing a large circle in the dirt. Look at the 72-hour mark. Every 3 days, the entire island undergoes a macro event. The trees on the south slope retreat, the beach expands by 50 yards, and the fog bank thickens until it hits the cliffs. I looked at the protocol's long-term forecast. She was right. Analysis, 72-hour megacycle confirmed, Phase 1, expansion, leaf growth, territory increase, Phase 2, contraction, fog, stability drop, sector shrinkage. Phase 3, reset, the golden window, 4 hours of total stability, the reset was the key. It was the only time the island stopped thinking. It was a 4-hour window where the gears stopped turning to lubricate themselves. If we move during the reset, I said, we can reach the interior. We can find the source. Or we can find the others, Gano said, appearing from the shadows. He looked pale. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled, yellowed piece of plastic. It wasn't the map I had drawn. It was a professional topographical map of the island, stained with old blood. Where did you get this? I asked. Found a camp, Gana said. About 2 miles inland, in a sector that just appeared this morning. It wasn't our ship, Woojin. It was a research vessel from the 90s. There were skeletons. They tried to map this place like it was a normal island. They drew mountains where there are now valleys. They died because they tried to stay in one place. I took the map. It was a graveyard of old logic. But before I could examine it, a shadow fell over us. Sojun was standing there, his arms crossed. He had been watching us from his side of the plateau, his frustration mounting as he saw my group eating well and staying calm. He had seen Gana hand me the map. A map, Sojun said, his voice a low rumble. You found a real map, didn't you? Not your scratches in the dirt. It's a map of a world that doesn't exist anymore, Sojun, I said, trying to hide it. I don't think so, he said, stepping closer. I think you've been holding out on us. I think there are buildings inland. Shelter. Radios. And you're keeping it for your little inner circle while my people are sleeping on cold rock. He turned to the rest of the survivors, his voice rising. Listen up. The observer found a map. There was a base here. A real base. He wants to keep it for himself, but I say we use it. I say we organize. We don't live like rats on a cliff, we take what's ours. The neutral survivors, desperate for any shred of hope, stood up. They didn't want to hear about megacycles or windows. They wanted a building with a roof. Sojun, wait, I warned. The map is useless. The island has changed 1,000 times since that was drawn. Then we'll force it to stay the same. Sojun shouted. We have the numbers. We have the strength. From now on, the map belongs to the group. And the group belongs to those who are willing to fight for it. He didn't just take the map. He took the narrative. By the end of the hour, he had declared a new law of the island. All resources, including the knowledge of the windows, were now public property under his command. He was building a hierarchy of force to counter my hierarchy of information. The transition happened 19 hours later, just as the 72-hour megacycle hit its peak. While Sojun sat huddled over the bloodstained topographical map, trying to reconcile the ink lines with the shifting reality of the jungle, I gathered my small group. Nari, Danu, Sungho, and Yunji stood in the shadow of the basalt ridge, their packs light and their eyes fixed on me. The reset begins in 10 minutes, I whispered. The island is going to go quiet. No hum, no shifting, no fog. For 4 hours, this place will act like a normal piece of land. But when the clock hits 0, the contraction starts. If we aren't back by then, we're part of the landscape. Where are we going? Sunho asked, clutching a salvaged mesh bag. Sector 11, I said. The system calls it the deep larder. It's a valley 3 miles inland that usually doesn't exist during the day. During the reset, it stabilizes. It's full of calorie-dense tubers and clean groundwater. Sojun is planning an expedition to the research station marked on his map, Nari noted, glancing toward the main camp. He's taking 20 people. He thinks it's only a mile away. Let him, I said. He's chasing a ghost. That station was built on a fault line that the island erased 20 years ago. Countdown TO reset, 1 minute and 45 seconds, atmospheric pressure, stabilizing, geological tension, 0.02% optimal. Suddenly, the subsonic hum that had been vibrating in my teeth for days vanished. The air, once heavy with ozone, became crisp and still. The shimmer in the distance faded. For the first time since the crash, the island felt dead. Move, I commanded. We swept through the jungle with a speed that Sojun's loud, heavy expedition could never match. While his group was hacking through vines and arguing over compass headings that no longer worked, we followed the golden path highlighted in my vision. We crossed a dry riverbed that had been a rushing torrent only 6 hours prior. We passed through a grove of trees that seemed frozen in time, their leaves perfectly still. We reached the deep larder in 90 minutes. It was a lush, sunken basin filled with oversized yams and crystal-clear pools of water. We worked in silence, filling our bags with enough food to last a week. We didn't waste a second. We didn't celebrate. We were looters in a house whose owner had stepped out for a moment, and we knew exactly when he was coming back. Reset window closing, 45 minutes and 12 seconds, we have to go, I said, hoisting a heavy pack. We made it back to the anchor zone with 20 minutes to spare. We were exhausted, our clothes torn by thorns, but our haul was massive. Sunho was already calculating how to preserve the tubers. We retreated to our basalt line and sat down, watching the horizon. 10 minutes later, the first groan returned. The island woke up. The contraction phase began with a violent shudder that nearly threw us off our feet. An hour after that, Sojun's expedition returned. They were broken. They hadn't found a research station, they had found a vertical cliff where the map said a valley should be. 2 of his men had twisted their ankles in a sudden sinkhole when the reset ended. They had no food, no water, and their official map was now soaked in mud. Face slap 4, status achieved, the contrast was brutal. My group of 6 sat around a small, efficient stove, eating roasted tubers and drinking clean water. The other 22 people stood in the cold wind, watching us with hollow eyes. Sojun stood in the center, his hand trembling as he held the useless piece of plastic. He had promised them a fortress, and he had given them a trek through a nightmare. His authority didn't collapse, but it cracked. Several neutral survivors simply picked up their bedrolls and walked over to our side of the plateau. They didn't ask for permission. They just sat down near Sungho's stove and waited. You knew, Sojun said, walking over to me. He didn't shout this time. His voice was dangerously quiet. You knew the map was wrong. You let me lead them out there into a trap. I told you it was a ghost, Sojun, I said, not looking up from my water bottle. You chose the ghost. I chose the clock. The clock is going to run out for you too, kid, he spat, but he didn't move to strike. He couldn't. Not when half the group was looking at me like I was their only chance at another meal. That night, as the camp settled into an uneasy silence, Yoonji crawled over to me. She looked more terrified than usual. Her eyes were darting toward the dark jungle below the cliff. Woo Jin, she whispered. I need to show you something. She led me to the edge of the basalt ridge, away from the others. She pointed toward the valley we had just looted. The three who disappeared, she said. Park Chul, and the two from the beach. I remembered their locations. I remembered what happened right before they went. The shift, I said. The sector reset. No, she shook her head vehemently. It wasn't just the timing. I remember the sound. In every case, someone was making a lot of noise. Park Chul was snoring loudly because of his cold. The other two were arguing. And today, when Sojun's men were at the cliff, they were shouting. That's when the sinkhole opened. I looked at her, then back at my protocol. I had been treating the island as a mechanical clock, a series of predetermined cycles. But Yoonji was suggesting something else. You think it's reactive? I asked. It's not just a clock, she whispered. It's a predator. It doesn't just change. It hunts. When we make noise, the stability drops faster. The island, it hears us. I checked the logs. Are analyzing sector transitions, correlation detected, acoustic output versus stability decay, coefficient 0.84, my blood ran cold. The system confirmed it. The island wasn't just moving on a schedule, it was reacting to our presence. Every shout, every loud footfall, every heroic speech from Sojun was accelerating the decay of our environment. We've been ringing a dinner bell, I murmured. This changed everything. If the island was listening, then our survival didn't just depend on knowing when to move. It depended on our absolute silence. And I knew, looking at Sojun's noisy, desperate camp, that silence was the one thing he could never provide. The atmosphere on the northwest cliffs had soured into something toxic, mirroring the volatile landscape below. It began with a leak. One of the neutral survivors, a man named Jihoon who had been hovering between the two camps for a week, had been caught whispering with Sojun's lieutenants. He had traded a piece of information for an extra ration of dry crackers. He told Sojun about the 72-hour megacycle. He told him that I didn't just guess the stability, I knew the exact timing of the island's pulse. Sojun's reaction was immediate and aggressive. He didn't come to me to negotiate. He came to take control. At midday, as the sun hung like a dull, copper coin behind the permanent haze, Sojun marched across the basalt line. He was accompanied by 20 men and women, all of them armed with sharpened rebar, heavy stones, or thick clubs of petrified wood. My small circle, Nari, Ganu, Sungho, and Yoonji, stood their ground, but the disparity was staggering. It was 22 against 6. The secrets are over, Woojin, Sojun barked, his voice echoing off the granite walls. He stood in a wide, aggressive stance, his chest heaving with the exertion of his own adrenaline. You've been playing us. You've been using this cycle to keep us hungry while you and your favorites gorge yourselves on the best sectors. You have a system in your head, or on a piece of plastic I haven't found yet. I want it. All of it. It's not a secret I can hand you like a canteen, Sojun, I said, my hands shoved deep into my pockets. I was watching my HUD. Sector, anchor zone, current stability, 68%, acoustic interference, high, stability decay rate, plus 0.4% per minute. Every word Sojun shouted was pushing the stability lower. The island was listening. Liar! Sojun roared, stepping into my personal space. You have a map of the windows. You have the schedule. From this moment on, that schedule belongs to the collective. You will tell us exactly when the next reset happens. You will tell us where the safe zones are. If you don't, we're putting you and your 4 friends off this cliff. You can go observe the ocean. It was an ultimatum. The crowd behind him murmured in agreement, their faces masks of desperation. They were tired of being afraid, and Sojun had given them a target for their fear. I looked at the countdown on my display. Phase, contraction imminent, time until event, 11 hours 4 minutes and 12 seconds. The contraction was the most dangerous part of the 72-hour cycle. It was when the island's borders shrank, the fog rolled in, and the land itself began to fold in on itself. If the stability was high, we would be fine on the anchor zone. But Sojun was throwing a tantrum on the very rock we needed to keep quiet. In 11 hours, I said, my voice calm but loud enough to be heard, the island is going to contract. It's the peak of the cycle. It's when the shimmer becomes a physical wall. If we stay quiet, we'll survive it here. If we keep shouting, the stability will hit zero before the fog even arrives. He's doing it again. Sojun laughed, turning to his followers. Another prophecy. Another threat to keep us in line. He's trying to scare you so you don't take what's yours. He turned back to me, the tip of his rebar spear inches from my throat. Give me the map, Wojin. Now. I faced the fourth major dilemma of my time on the island. I could tell them everything, try to explain the acoustic triggers, the system logs, the invisible lines of probability. But they wouldn't believe me, and even if they did, Sojun would just use that knowledge to run a louder, more dangerous camp. Or, I could say nothing and watch the contraction tear them apart. I chose a third path. I won't give you a map that doesn't exist, I said. But I will give you a warning. Everyone who wants to live through the night, move your bedrolls to the northern basalt line. Stay as far from the center of the plateau as possible. Do not speak. Do not light a fire. Do not even sharpen your tools. If you stay in the center with Sojun, you are ringing the bell for the island to find you. Don't listen to him. Sojun screamed. He's trying to divide us. We stay in the center. We stay together. Strength in numbers. I ignored him. I turned to my group. Get the gear moved. Every ounce of it. We're moving to the absolute edge of the stable zone. As the afternoon wore on, a subtle but profound shift occurred. Of the 22 people following Sojun, 14 of them, the neutral ones who had seen the fruit rot in the beach flood, quietly picked up their things. They didn't say a word to me. They didn't thank me. They simply walked away from the center of the plateau and settled in a tight, silent line near the basalt ridge. Sojun was left with 8 die-hard followers. They remained in the center, defiantly building a large, roaring bonfire, shouting songs, and laughing as if they were back on a weekend camping trip. They were performing strength, but the island only saw vibration. Stability rating, 42%, critical, acoustic trigger, active. Yunji sat next to me, her hands trembling as she held a piece of charcoal. She was sketching the way the fog was beginning to form at the base of the cliffs. It wasn't rolling in from the sea this time, it was rising from the cracks in the stone. It's happening faster, isn't it? She whispered. Because of the noise, I said. Sojun is literally shouting us into the grave. As the 11-hour mark approached, the sun vanished, replaced by a suffocating darkness. The contraction began not with a bang, but with a hum so deep it felt like it was vibrating in my very marrow. At the center of the camp, Sojun and his 8 men were having a war council. Their voices were loud, confident, and utterly doomed. We'll go inland at dawn. Sojun's voice carried through the night. We'll find the source and wheel. Suddenly, the white fog didn't just drift in, it erupted. It came from the central fissure, the very one Minho had cut days before. Within seconds, the center of the plateau was a white void. The bonfire didn't go out, it simply became a dull, orange glow that provided no light. Then, the screams started. It wasn't the scream of people being attacked. It was the scream of people losing their sense of up and down. The fog was so thick it was liquid. People were choking on it, their lungs unable to process the ozone-heavy mist. Wojin! Nari cried out, reaching for me in the dark. Stay still. I commanded. We are on the 91% stable line. The fog won't cross the basalt. I looked through the protocol's lens. My vision was a tactical grid of green and red. The center of the plateau was a pulsing, angry scarlet. Sector, camp center, status, RE leveling in progress, probability of fatality, 22%. I could have stayed where I was. I could have let the island finish what Sojun started. But I knew that if Sojun died now, he would become a martyr for the survivors' frustration. If he lived, he would be a debt-ridden failure. Gano, Nari, grab the ropes, I said. We're going in. Are you crazy? Sunho hissed. You just said it was a death trap. Not for me, I said. I can see the path. I stepped into the white wall. To the others, I was vanishing into a void. To me, I was walking through a wireframe of the world. I followed the green line provided by the protocol, stepping over fissures that hadn't opened yet and ducking under branches that were about to snap. I found them huddled together, paralyzed by the fog. Sojun was on his knees, his rebar spear clattering against the stone, his eyes wide and blind. He was sobbing, a broken man who couldn't fight a cloud. Take the rope, Sojun, I said, my voice cutting through the suffocating mist. He reached out, his hand trembling, and grabbed the line. I led them out, one by one, pulling 8 broken men and women from the heart of the contraction. When we emerged into the clear air of the basalt ridge, the contrast was staggering. The 14 neutrals stood in total silence, watching as I led the strongmen out of the fog like lost children. When the last of Sojun's men stumbled out of the fog, gasping for air that didn't taste like static electricity, a profound silence fell over the northwest cliffs. The 28 survivors stood in 2 distinct groups, the 14 who had listened to the warning, standing dry and calm on the basalt ridge, and the 8 who had followed Sojun into the center, now shivering, covered in a fine gray soot from the atmospheric shift. Sojun sat on the ground, his massive shoulders slumped, his hands gripping the rope I had used to lead him out. He looked up at me, his face pale in the pre-dawn light. There was no rage left in him, only a hollow, echoing confusion. He had led men into battle, he had built a hierarchy of strength, and he had just been defeated by a cloud. I didn't offer him a hand up. I didn't offer him water. I simply stood before the entire group, the translucent HUD of the protocol flickering across my vision like a ghostly constellation. I am not your leader, I said, my voice cutting through the damp air with the precision of a scalpel. I am not your king, and I am not your savior. If you want a hero, look at Sojun. He'll tell you how to fight, how to hoard, and how to shout. He'll lead you right into the next collapse because he thinks the island cares about his rank. I turned my gaze to the 14 who had moved to the basalt line. You survived tonight because you chose to listen to the data. You chose silence over noise. You chose the cliff's edge over the center's comfort. That is the only law this place recognizes. You knew exactly when it would happen, one of the men from Sojun's inner circle rasped, his voice trembling. You could have stopped it earlier. You let us suffer just to prove a point. I told you exactly what would happen, I replied, my eyes locking onto his. You chose to call it a lie. The island doesn't give second chances, but apparently, I do. This is the last one. From this moment on, there is no Sojun's group and no Observer's group. There is only the system. We move during the reset. We remain silent during the contraction. We gather what the island provides in the windows it gives us. If you follow the schedule, you eat. If you follow the noise, you disappear. Sojun stood up slowly, using his rebar spear as a crutch. He looked at his followers, then at the 14 who were already looking to me for the next instruction. He was a man who had lived his whole life by the logic of the loudest voice, and he had just realized that on this island, the loudest voice was the first one to be silenced. What now, Woojin? Sojun asked, his voice a gravelly whisper. The challenge was gone. It was a request. Now, we prepare for the next 72-hour cycle, I said. The reset begins in 4 hours. It's our only window to move. We're going to the interior. Not to find a research station or a base, but to find the source of the pulse. Face slap 5, authority realigned, group cohesion, 82%, acoustic interference, minimal. As the group began to organize, Sunho distributing the last of the tubers, Nari checking the injured, I walked to the very edge of the northern cliff. The fog was still churning in the valleys below, but as the sun began to break through the haze, the protocol's HUD flared with a new, blindingly bright notification. It wasn't a stability rating. It wasn't a resource marker. It was a rhythmic, pulsing signal coming from the deep center of the island, a place the topographical map labeled as a dead zone. Source identified, Sector 0, signal type, temporal anchor, frequency, 0.013 Hz, heartbeat detected. The island had a heart. A central mechanism that dictated the shifts, the resets, and the cycles. And for the first time, the protocol wasn't just observing it. It was receiving a response. Suddenly, the green and red lines of my vision flickered and died. The HUD went black for a terrifying 3 seconds. When it returned, the text was no longer the standard blue of the observer protocol. It was a searing, crystalline white. Warning, observer identity confirmed, adaptation protocol initiated, environmental response, active engagement. My breath hitched. Active engagement didn't sound like a measurement. It sounded like a declaration of war. I looked at the trees below, the serrated leaves Yunji had mentioned. They weren't just changing their patterns anymore. They were turning, all of them, to face the northwest cliffs. The island wasn't just reacting to our noise anymore. It was looking at me. Wojin? Yunji whispered, appearing at my side. She was holding her charcoal pencil so hard it snapped. The patterns, they've stopped mirroring the cracks in the rock. What are they doing now? I asked, though I already knew the answer. They're mirroring your eyes, she said, her voice trembling. The vein patterns in the leaves, they look like the map you drew. They're tracking you. I looked back at the camp. Sojun was sitting by the fire, talking quietly to 2 of his men. He looked defeated, but his eyes were darting toward the southern beach where the wreckage still lay. Ghana caught my eye and gave a subtle, sharp nod toward Sojun. He had seen what I hadn't, Sojun wasn't just resting. He was planning. He was gathering wood, not for a fire, but for a raft. He was going to use the next reset to make a break for the sea, and if he did, he would trigger every acoustic alarm the island had. But that wasn't the biggest threat anymore. I looked back at the white text in my vision. Adaptation Stage 1, complete, target, Kenwoojin, next reconfiguration, 3 hours 59 minutes and 59 seconds. The island was no longer just a prison. It was a predator that had finally recognized its prey. And the prey had just been given the keys to the cage. The sun didn't just rise on the morning of the reset, it bled into the sky, a bruised purple that made the gray sand of the distant beach look like ash. As the 72-hour mark approached, the silence I had enforced was absolute. No one spoke. Even the injured suppressed their groans, terrified by the memory of the suffocating fog. But as I stood at the edge of the basalt ridge, looking toward the valley where we had harvested the tubers only days ago, the protocol's HUD didn't show the green-golden path. Instead, the grid was a chaotic, flickering mess of static. Sector analysis, deep larder, status, deleted, reason, adaptive redundancy, my heart skipped a beat. Deleted? I whispered. The valley hadn't just shifted, it had been removed from the island's geometry. Because I had identified it as a resource, the island had scrubbed it. The adaptation protocol wasn't just observing me, it was actively editing the world to spike my knowledge. Woojin, look, Nari whispered, pointing her notebook toward the southern shore. Down on the beach, nearly a mile away but visible through the clear morning air, Sojun and 3 of his most loyal men were moving. They weren't scavenging. They were dragging a massive, heavy slab of white fiberglass, a section of the Aegean Blue's hull, across the jagged rocks toward the surf. The sound was faint to us, but to the island, it must have been like a siren. The screech of fiberglass on stone echoed through the silence. Proximity alert, acoustic trigger, shoreline, stability decay, 12% PR/second, sector border, expanding, he's building the raft, I realized, my grip tightening on the strap of my pack. He's going to try and launch it during the reset window. If he drags that thing into the water, he'll trigger the beach's collapse right when we're trying to cross the lower ridge, Gano said, his voice sharp with anger. The idiot is going to sink the whole southern sector. He doesn't care, I said. He thinks if he gets far enough out, the cycles won't reach him. He's wrong. The ocean is part of the system too. I turned to the group of 14 neutrals who were now looking at me for guidance. They saw the raft. They saw the escape Sojun was offering, and I could see the temptation in their eyes. The cliffs were a prison, the raft was a hope, however slim. He's going to wake the island up, I warned them. The reset starts in 20 minutes. If you follow him to that raft, you'll be on the sand when the stability hits 0. Stay here. We're going inland. To where? One of the women asked. You said the valley is gone. To Sector 0, I said. To the heart. Just as I spoke, the white text of the protocol flared again, so bright it made my eyes water. Adaptation Stage 2, Predictive Mapping, Simulation, Observer Pathway to Sector 0, Response, Terrain Obstruction Initiated. In front of our eyes, the path leading down from the northwest cliffs didn't just shift, it dissolved. A massive section of the stone staircase we had intended to use simply crumbled into a fine powder, leaving a sheer, 50-foot drop. The island was no longer just removing resources, it was blocking my specific intent. It knows where we're going, Yunji whispered, her voice trembling. Wu Jin, it's reading the map in your head. I stood at the edge of the new cliff, looking down at the impossible drop. The island was learning. Every time I made a plan, the protocol logged it, and the island responded by making that plan impossible. I was the one feeding the predator. Change of plan, I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous tone. What do we do? Nari asked. We don't go to Sector 0, I said. I looked directly at a cluster of those strange, mirrored leaves, knowing the island was watching through them. We're going to the beach. We're going to help Sojun with the raft. Adaptation log, target intent shifted TO shoreline, reconfiguring southern sector. I watched the HUD. The red grid began to shift toward the beach. The island began to focus its obstruction logic on the shore, preparing to trap us there. Wu Jin, are you serious? Ghana hissed. The beach is a death trap. I'm lying, I whispered, barely moving my lips. I'm lying to the island. I realized then that the protocol was a two-way street. If the island could read my intent through the system, I could feed it false data. I had to think like a virus. I had to project one plan while executing another. Everyone. We're heading for the raft. I shouted, loud enough for the leaves to hear, for the stone to vibrate. The inland is too dangerous. The beach is our only hope. I began to lead the group toward the southern slope, making as much noise as possible. My HUD was a frenzy of activity. Adaptation active, rerouting geological stress to southern slope, Sector 0 stability, increasing, unmonitored. The island fell for it. It began to pour its energy into making the southern path a nightmare of thorns and sinking sand. And in that moment, as the island's attention was focused on the beach, a small, narrow crevice opened up behind us, near the basalt ridge. It was a path the system hadn't flagged because I hadn't intended to use it. Now, I whispered to my core group. The crevice. Silent. Fast. Don't even think about where we're going. Just move. We slipped into the dark crack in the rock just as the reset began. Behind us, we could hear the screeching of Sojun's fiberglass raft and the roar of the island's southern sector collapsing under the weight of its own adaptive fury. I looked at the HUD one last time before the darkness of the crevice swallowed us. Observer status, uncertain, adaptation, error, target lost, current stress level, maximum. The island was screaming in its own silent way, searching for me in the chaos of the beach. But we were already gone, moving into the lightless veins of the island, toward a heart that was finally starting to beat in time with mine. The crevice was not a natural formation, it was a throat. As we descended into the lightless depths of the island, the air changed from the salty tang of the northwest cliffs to a heavy, metallic humidity that tasted of copper and ozone. My HUD was a frantic blur of white noise, struggling to recalibrate as we moved through a zone that the system had previously flagged as undefined. Every few seconds, the translucent grid would flare, trying to map the walls, only to see them ripple and shift like the interior of a lung. Location, Sector 0, the vascular zone, stability, unstable adaptive flux, observer status, anomalous. Don't look at the walls, I whispered, my voice barely a breath. If you look at the patterns, you're feeding it data. Keep your eyes on the heels of the person in front of you. Nari was right behind me, her breathing shallow and rhythmic. Behind her, Danu moved with the silent grace of a predator, his hand resting on the hilt of a sharpened obsidian blade he'd fashioned during the last reset. Yunji and Sunho brought up the rear, carrying the heavy packs of tubers and water. We were a line of ghosts moving through the digestive tract of a god. The ground beneath our boots wasn't stone anymore. It was a dense, fibrous material that felt like petrified muscle. Every few steps, a low-frequency thrum would vibrate through the soles of our feet, the heartbeat I had detected earlier. It was getting louder, a rhythmic thump-thump that seemed to sync with my own pulse. Suddenly, the protocol's HUD flared with a crimson warning. Adaptation triggered, thermal signature detected, countermeasure, internal purge. Down. I hissed, shoving Nari against the vibrating wall. A split second later, a wave of scalding steam hissed from the pores in the ceiling. It wasn't a random vent, it was targeted. The island was trying to sweat us out. I watched as the HUD tracked the heat, showing me a narrow cool zone that moved like a shifting shadow. I dragged the group through it, our skin stinging from the heat, our lungs burning with the humid air. It knows we lied, Yoonji whimpered, her memory for patterns already failing as the environment became too alien to categorize. The beach, it didn't work. It worked for a moment, I said, checking the external logs. On the southern shore, the chaos was absolute. Through the system's remote sensors, limited as they were, I could see the disaster unfolding. Sojun had successfully launched his fiberglass raft, but the moment the hull hit the water, the acoustic trigger I had predicted hit a critical threshold. The beach didn't just flood, it liquefied. A massive sinkhole had opened beneath the surf, dragging the raft and the 8 people on it into a churning vortex of sand and saltwater. Sojun wasn't dead, not yet. I could see his heat signature clinging to a jagged spire of rock, screaming into the wind as his escape was swallowed by the very ocean he thought was his salvation. His noise was still serving a purpose, drawing the island's primary defensive focus toward the coast, but the internal purge in our tunnel meant the island was beginning to multitask. Alert, Sector 0 transition in 5 minutes, stability in core, 99% absolute, we're almost there, I urged the group. Once we hit the core, the island can't shift the terrain without destroying itself. It's the anchor for everything. We broke out of the vascular tunnel into a space that defied logic. Sector 0 was a cathedral of light and geometry. It was a hollow sphere, miles across, illuminated by a central orb of pulsing, bioluminescent energy that hung suspended by massive, translucent cables. These weren't roots, they were fiber optic nerves, glowing with the data of every shift, every reset, every death on the island. The floor was a perfect, polished mirror of black glass. As we stepped onto it, our reflections didn't just follow us, they multiplied. Thousands of versions of Kanwoojin, Lee Nari, and the others stretched out into the infinite darkness of the sphere. Core identified, the temporal engine, observer access, granted, my god, Nari whispered, her notebook falling from her hand. It's not an island. It's a processor. The shifts, the fruit, the fog, it's all just subroutines. It's a simulation running on biological hardware. And we're the bugs in the code, I said, walking toward the central orb. As I approached the light, the protocol's HUD began to dissolve. The blue lines turned into liquid gold, flowing out of my vision and onto the black glass floor. The text began to scroll at a speed I couldn't follow, a history of the island, thousands of years of observations. I saw the research vessel from the 90s. I saw ancient triremes. I saw people from eras that shouldn't have existed, all caught in the same 72-hour cycle. But then, the white text returned, overriding everything. It was no longer a warning. It was a greeting. Observer Kanwoojin, synchronization at 94%, adaptation complete, target incorporated, initiating phase 2, system upgrade, Woojin, what's happening to you? Ghana shouted, drawing his blade. I looked down at my hands. They were glowing with the same crystal and white light as the HUD. The lines of the protocol were etched into my skin, glowing through my veins. I wasn't just reading the system anymore, I was becoming the system's interface. The island isn't trying to kill me, I realized, the truth hitting me with the force of a tidal wave. It's trying to become me. It needs a localized intelligence to manage the increasing complexity of the survivors. It's not a predator, it's an employer. Woojin, step away from it. Nari yelled, reaching for my arm, but her hand passed right through my shoulder as if I were made of smoke. I looked back at the entrance to the sphere. Through the vascular tunnels, I could hear a new sound. It wasn't the hum of the island or the screams of Sojun. It was the sound of heavy, rhythmic footsteps. Proximity alert, system guardians activated. From the darkness, 3 figures emerged. They looked like humans, but their skin was the same gray sand as the beach, and their eyes were glowing apertures of blue light. They moved with a mechanical, terrifying precision. They were the adaptations the island had created to handle the bugs that were no longer useful. They weren't coming for me. They were coming for Nari, Ghana, and the others. The deal is this, a voice said, not in my ears, but directly in my mind. It was the voice of the island, a composite of 1,000 drowned souls. Accept the integration. Manage the cycles. Protect the engine. And your group lives. They become the new baseline for the next 72-hour cycle. They become the masters of the new world. And if I refuse? I thought. The system showed me a simulation of the next 3 seconds, the Guardians tearing Nari and Ganu apart, followed by the total collapse of the anchor zone, dumping the remaining 14 survivors into the sea. I looked at Nari. She was looking at me with a mix of terror and heartbreaking trust. She didn't know the choice I was making. She only saw her friend disappearing into a sun. Integration, 98%, final authorization required. I looked at the central orb. I saw the power to rewrite the island. I saw the power to bring back Park Chul, to make the fruit sweet forever, to build a fortress that would never fall. But I also saw the price, I would never leave. I would be the ghost in the machine, watching the survivors live their lives in a perfect, controlled cage of my own making. Far away, on the beach, Sojun let out one last, desperate cry as the water closed over his head. I reached out and touched the heart of the island. Integration, 100%, welcome, administrator. The light exploded, consuming the sphere, the black glass, and the screams of my friends. Inventory check. End of Arc 1, survivors, 23, 14 neutrals, 5 core group, for remaining of Sojun's faction. Status of Kanwujin, disincarnate/system administrator, phase 1. Sector 0, secured. The island, resetting. New problem, the Guardians are still active, and they no longer recognize the survivors as guests. As the light fades, Nari and the others find themselves back on the northwest cliffs. The anchor zone is twice as large, and a clean fresh water spring is bubbling from the center. They are safe. They are fed. But when Nari looks at the horizon, she doesn't see the sun. She sees a giant, translucent eye made of data scrolls, blinking once before vanishing. And in her pocket, her leather-bound notebook has been replaced by a sleek, black tablet. On the screen, a single message is blinking in liquid gold: Administrator Woojin, Phase 2 begins in 71 hours 59 minutes and 59 seconds. Prepare the survivors. The real test starts now. The island didn't just change. It upgraded. And the first thing it built was a wall that no ship would ever find. End of protocol, the Observer.